Oh, hello. Don't mind us. We're just texting each other here. Sometimes it feels like we kind of catch ourselves on our phones and doing a number of different things, and we're talking through text with the person right beside you, or when you can easily just be talking to them. Today, on this Family Matters devotional, we're going to be talking about communication. And no, it's not necessarily about technology and phones or anything like that, though it is a means to communicate. What I really want to talk about is communication in marriage and how vital and essential it is. One of the things that I realize in marriage is how important communication is over the lifespan of marriage. In fact, communication is important in everything. I grew up playing sports, and in sports, you have to communicate as a team. There's not one sport where if you don't communicate, it gets better. There's not one facet of life that I can think of where if we don't communicate with each other, things get better. And so when I think about marriage, for me, communication is key. And not even just the act of communicating, it's how we communicate. What is communication in marriage really made up of? And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about here today. And so it might be a little bit revealing. It may be airing some of our dirty laundry. I'm not sure. I'll just say this. If we're not here next week to do this devotion, then you know Pastor didn't like anything we said, and he found somebody else to do it better than what we did. So tune in next week if this doesn't work out so well. So I start off with this passage here for at least the men from a husband's perspective. But in reality, this passage is written from a seasoned pastor to his mentee, a mentor to a mentee in Timothy. So 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 18 says this, that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. Now, two words in there I want to key in on here for this thought from the husband standpoint. And no, we're talking as a preacher, so let's just say it from the most basic sense is from a man's point of view. So the man of God, the preacher, the husband, the father, all those roles, any of those roles apply within this verse. That the man should be ready to distribute. What it's saying is we ought to give of ourselves. And one way we can give of ourselves is of our time, in our communication, our attention. Another is the word actually we see here, communicate, which is any time it's used in the Bible. And that word communicate is really talking about being ready and willing to talk and listen. So giving of myself, men giving of ourselves to be ready and willing to talk and listen. Now I look at this from a preacher standpoint and I say, as a pastor, as a Christian, as a minister of God's word, yeah, I want to be ready and willing to give of myself to talk with other people. But it's amazing how dangerous it can get whenever I'm so focused on others and other people, and how much I don't leave enough room in my own marriage with my wife or even with our children. And so I read that verse and I say, my priority first is, am I ready to distribute? Am I willing to communicate first with me privately with God? And then, am I willing to communicate and ready to distribute with my wife, and then my children and our family and ministry? And I want to make sure I have the right priority in this, but for the sake of this topic, I'm using this verse as it relates to the relationship between a husband and wife. So I'll ask you this, what is for us, okay, this is the airing dirty laundry part here, for us, how do you describe, or what is a picture of good communication?
I would say when we are listening to each other and hearing each other, not just listening, but actually hearing what the other person's saying.
What'd you say? I'm just
exactly
kidding.
right. I guess you could even think of your body language. It would say a lot too if we're actually completely involved in the conversation or distracted. Or so, good communication would be not having distractions around, like our phones or whatever, like texting or TV or kids or.
We've actually done that before with our phones, where we were sitting beside each other, and I decided to text her because I realized how long ago we sat beside each other and never really said a word to each other, and we're just texting or looking on social media and that. And I started texting her like, "Hey, what are you doing?" She said something like, I forget what it was, but it was like, I'm looking at my phone or looking at Facebook or something.
Yeah, I don't remember.
And then I finally texted her back and I said, "You feel like talking at all?"
Yeah.
And it wasn't an accusation against her. It was more of an accusation for both of us to say, man, we ought to just spend some time with each other instead of beside each other on our phones. Do you remember that at all?
Yeah, I think it was like probably Christmas Day or something when people, everyone just got done unwrapping presents and you finally just sit and relax, and then you're sitting there searching, and time just flies when you're doing that. You don't even realize how long, and then you realize an hour later you haven't even said a word to the person you're sitting next to.
And so we talked a little bit about what good communication looks like between us. So tell me, or maybe explain for the folks watching, maybe what bad communication looked like between us.
Well, I think sometimes one person's not ready to have a conversation, like whether it's we're busy or distracted with other things or emotionally not ready, depending on what the conversation is, or I would say probably bad would be when we already have decided what I know what you're going to say, so I'm just going to wait and for you to stop speaking so I can respond to what I thought you were going to say, not what you actually said. So then I'm not really listening to hear you. I'm just listening for you to stop talking so I can say what.
You're saying you do that.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I'm guilty of that too. I've done that too. And, the one thing about, the one thing I appreciate about it, that we can laugh at ourselves sometimes. And in hindsight, we're not laughing in the moment sometimes when, we're having poor communication with each other. But it's nice to be able to laugh about times and just think about how silly we were being at a certain point in time. Maybe out there, married couples, you don't have any arguments or fights or discussions, or one person's not fully connected in the conversation while the other is. For us, I mean, we kind of have to catch ourselves, and sometimes we can laugh about it. Sometimes we can laugh about it a few weeks later. Sometimes we can laugh about it a few years later. But it's just funny to think, over the years how important communication has really been, and really how practicing good communication between each other has really helped over the years.
Yeah. I think we've grown a lot in that area through our marriage and understanding. Sometimes I would say you may have a certain look, and before I would take it personal, where it could totally be he does not understand what I just said and he's trying to process it in his head, and I'm like offended because he has this look on his face and it really wasn't something you were trying to be offensive about. But now, like, I can know, okay, wait, he's not trying to be rude. He's just thinking about what I said and what it means and processing it, the information.
And I even have to try and catch myself, because even still this day, if I don't understand something, I'm going to keep digging and prodding, and I'll start asking questions. And my mind's firing off at 100 miles an hour, and I just start asking question after question and question. And in my mind, I'm like, I'm just trying to really understand. I'm trying to get to a place where, I can get on the same level as where you're at and what you're talking about. But in reality, your mind, your eyeballs are rolling in the back of your head, and you're just overwhelmed by the questions.
So like it's interrogation time, like what's going on here?
And I'm just really just thinking out loud and really not taking a step back and trying to process first. And I'm just, trying to troubleshoot or trying to figure something out on the spot. And that's not always historically been the best way to do things. But nonetheless, it has gotten better over the years. So
yeah.
As we finish airing our dirty laundry, I wrote down some practical helps, I guess is the best way I can put it, on what helps us in our communication and how we communicate with each other. And really, I think this applies in every facet of communication, whether it be with our children, with our family members, with our friends, in ministry, at work, day-to-day interactions. I mean, you can't go through life without interacting with people. And if you're going to interact with people, we automatically whether verbally or non-verbally, we're communicating, and we're communicating something. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure whatever it is we communicate, one, it glorifies and honors God. Two, it's helpful, it's thoughtful, it's insightful, it's kind, and in a way that ultimately speaks to Christ who is in us. So we wrote down some things here, and these aren't necessarily new, or I wouldn't even say they're fully our own thoughts. I think I've seen them in many different ways in many different books on marriage and communication as a whole. So the first thought we had put down was be present in the conversation. Obviously, if Bonnie's on her phone and I'm trying to talk to her, we're not really present in the conversation. Or if we're trying to multitask when we're trying to have a discussion or trying to talk about something, that usually doesn't bode well in our conversation and how we communicate.
Right.
Talking and listening. So you mentioned this before. So I think the worst habit I have in communicating is I'm thinking of what I want to say next while you're speaking to me, instead of listening to what you're saying and processing that and responding in context of what you're talking about, as opposed to thinking what I want to say next before I even listen to where you're coming from. And in danger of doing that, of course, is I'm totally missing your perspective, totally missing your viewpoint, and even sometimes to the detriment of our communication, really causing that much more miscommunication or misunderstanding between us, and actually taking that much longer to get to a place where we're both on the same page. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think we've both done that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you so more than me, but I mean, you know, we're working on it, and I'm working on you, so. Here's the other thing about discussion, or about talking and listening. Don't make any presumptions or assumptions, meaning I don't want to have all the points and counterpoints before I even go to my wife and talk to her about something. Whereas I've thought this whole scenario through, and it's been on my mind for a certain amount of time, but yet she hasn't even considered it. And then I go to her, and I'm already preloaded with everything I want to say, what I think she would say, what I would say back to that, and what I think she would respond after that, and then how I would respond to her responding.
Yeah, we already had that conversation in our head or something, and then hit you out of the blue, like, and don't give each other time to even process what's being said, because we've already had this whole conversation. Yeah,
that I've only found for us that leads to one, the person's not ready. One of us is not ready to have to be able to communicate, and the second is it's not fair to the other person who hasn't had any time to process and consider and think. Yet I would be demanding then that she be ready to just step right in on a moment's notice when I've had this whole preparation and presumption and assumption in my head. So try to avoid doing those things. The other facet of talking and listening, I realize, is that mind reading is not a spiritual gift. Go figure. Nowhere in the Bible, Romans 12, Ephesians 4, you name it, is mind reading in there. It is not a spiritual gift by anybody. So I also realize it's not even a developable talent, meaning I can't grow into the powers of mind reading, into what exactly my wife is thinking.
Too bad.
It's a dangerous place in there.
That's true.
As for my mind.
It might be scary.
But what I mean by that, I guess, is I don't want to say, well, I know this is what you're thinking. Right. I know you meant it this way. And that's dangerous territory, because now I'm presuming that I have foreknowledge and insight and this all-knowingness as God does with my wife. And though I've been with her for 19 years, and we've been married for a long time now, 19 years, I don't know exactly what's in her head and in her heart at all times in every way. And so I don't want to presume or assume that I know everything in her mind, as if I am mentally reading her mind.
Honestly, ladies, we never even know that either. So how are we supposed to expect them to?
What's another one? For talking and listening, yelling and screaming do not qualify as talking and listening. No. So that never goes well. Never did yelling and screaming ever get us to a better place.
No.
So that's no bueno. When one person is talking, the other must be listening and not mentally preparing what they want to say next. And I think we covered that area pretty well. So be present in the conversation, talking and listening. The other one is take your time and have some patience. In communicating with each other, when we're talking about things that are of any kind of importance, we don't want to rush through it. We want to have a conversation that we can be not only present for, but have the time to have a conversation that is not just passing by, dropping off a laundry list of things. Will you do this and that, or can you do that, or will you please? That kind of conversation or communication. So time and patience, honesty. Honesty. You say, well, that's kind of a given. We should be honest with our spouses. Yes, but Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25 says this: "Wherefore, putting away lying, speaking every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another." Lies always, always, always impact effective communication. There's no relationship that ever got better through somebody's lies. It only made it worse. In fact, it's not just telling the truth, but telling the truth in a way that you're speaking with loving kindness. And that goes to Ephesians 4:15. But speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. What I want to be able to do is, with my wife, I want to speak honestly with her, but I want to do it in a way that's tactful and loving and kind, and not just being blunt and hurtful. There's a time where we need to be upfront and honest, but we need to be careful about how we do that. Anything you can think of regarding that?
I think one thing we have to, with the honesty, is even being honest with ourselves. Like, for me, when we go back to even mind reading or whatever, like, you're trying to understand what I'm thinking. Well, like I said before, sometimes we don't even understand our feelings. So instead of trying to just put an answer out there, like, that would make them happy and stop the conversation, just be honest. Be like, you know what? I really don't understand why I feel this way or that way, but I want to work through it or whatever. Or, just being honest with how you're feeling or things like that too.
So being honest enough to say you don't know, or you're not sure, or you don't know why.
Yeah.
So for me, that's a big deal, because why is always a weird question to ask. But I find myself asking that, and then it's odd for me whenever we don't know the why. But it happens to everybody. We don't always know why we do every single thing we do. We like to think there's always a why behind it, but sometimes we don't understand why we did, and it takes a little while to step back, process that, to be able to do it. And it's hard to answer on the spot, right?
Yeah.
So respect. Speak with respect. That's a little bit different than honesty. What I mean by that is, for me, it's important that I leave my wife with her dignity. For instance, if I say, well, you're just being stupid, or you're being a jerk about it, I'm in a place where I'd never wanted to be with my wife, or never want to be in this position where we're at name calling, or we don't say, well, I'm not calling your name, I'm saying you're acting like this. That's still pretty rough and pretty harsh to do. And what I found by that, from my end as a husband, is I realize, and I think I have my own too, but everybody has their own insecurities. You have your own insecurities, and I may hit on something that you're already insecure about, and use a word that triggers that insecurity for you. And now I've just made that and bubbled up something that you've internalized and kept, that you're dealing with and battling. Now I've confronted you with that, as opposed to leaving you with your dignity and not pointing that out and thinking of another way to address the issue without saying you're acting like this or you're being like that.
Yeah.
So, I guess the way I look at this is, not to feed your spouse's insecurities, or highlighting their failures. No name calling, of course. And I definitely don't want to speak to you as a child. But I do think that when we're speaking to each other, I think the thing that I think is always lacking is, if we were speaking to a stranger, or somebody we're trying to minister to that's not in our family, maybe a new church member, or somebody who just got saved, or somebody we're witnessing to, I'm convicted by the fact that I will put more time and thought and prayer in how I approach them, or somebody I have to deal with for something in counseling. I will spend so much time and thought and prayer in how I want to approach them and how I want to talk to them, and make sure I have my words just so right as not to offend them or hurt them, or to push them away. But yet, do I do that with my own wife or my own children?
Yeah.
You know, isn't it funny how sometimes the people we hurt the most are the ones that are closest to us? And if we said the things we said to our spouse or our children or somebody close to us, they don't even come close to anybody we would ever say anything to outside of our home.
Right. Yeah. We take a lot more time to make sure we're speaking kind to people who aren't as close to us as, our family is. So yeah, that is crazy. They say you do hurt, like you said, that you hurt the ones you love the most.
So maybe I'm just gonna let strangers have it from now on, and just kind of just let loose on them.
No, please don't.
No. So leave your spouse with some dignity. Have speak respectfully to them. Speak with clarity, meaning explain things. For me, a lot of times I have to ask Bonnie to tell me a little bit more what she's trying to say, or explain to me a little bit better. I don't claim to know exactly her perspective. In fact, I'm glad that I don't have her exact perspective and see things the exact same way that she does, because that's what makes her such a great, or I'd say even the perfect helpmeet for me, in that she fills gaps in my life that I have that I'm very clueless on. And I would assume that, and there's some ways that some perspectives that I have that maybe I fill the gaps in that area for you.
Yeah, I would say when we're having our good conversations and we explain how each of us are thinking, or our opinion on the matter or whatever, even when we don't exactly have the same one, but we're able to explain why we think the way we do or whatever. And I could say to you, well, I understand why you think that, or, and just respect that, and getting the clarity on where you came to that decision or that thought or whatever really has always helped our conversation.
Yeah, I think some phrases or words to avoid in communicating with your spouse is, I don't know why you would even think that, or what were you thinking?
Yeah.
Or what made you even think like that?
Yeah, and even with your kids, you want to avoid that phrase, like, what were you thinking? Like, how could you do that? Those are phrases that don't build anyone up. It just makes you even question your own thoughts, like, oh, what was I thinking? Or, it's not something that builds somebody up.
I realize in asking our kids that from time to time, that they weren't always thinking.
Right.
They didn't, they don't even, it's not that they didn't know, they just weren't even considering that.
Right.
I have to kind of take a step back and think through that before I say that. And sometimes I catch myself saying it, and I'm like, and I sincerely want to know, what were you thinking? What was going through your mind?
This reminds me of when one of our children, I won't call her out, but she was little, and she decided to pick a rock up in the driveway and throw it at the van window. And of course it shattered, and thought was like, what were you thinking?
And it wasn't malicious, like she was angry.
Yeah,
throwing
she wasn't
it to break
mad.
Something.
She just actually wanted to know what would happen, but she was really little when it happened. But the kind of like your point, like sometimes they don't realize what the consequences could be, or what the whole process was.
Yeah. So when you're asking those kind of questions and trying to get clarity, think about how you want to ask to understand something better. Here's a great one. Tone. The tone you use. The problem I see today is that we try and have conversations, and we try and communicate primarily through technology. And I'll say this, texting is tone deaf. So I cannot, for the life of me, understand somebody's tone, no matter how many different emojis they may use in their texting. Most people don't even know what half those emojis mean. We've had our kids send us emojis that are actually bad words that they didn't realize. So don't use technology as the primary means to communicate. Try and set personal time aside to rationally and calmly talk, and that's so very important. Restraint. When emotions are high, it may be best to not engage and wait until everyone is calm. Defer to the one who is asking to wait. If Bonnie asks me to wait to have a conversation that I want to have right now, I need to give her that time because she's saying she's not prepared to talk. That doesn't really happen often for us where we have to do that, but it is important. There's been times where you say, hey, we need to talk, and I say, okay, I'm going to drop everything. There's times where I left work and came home and said, okay, let's talk about this because we don't want to wait. It's that important to you. I don't want to put other things in front of you or put you on the back burner. I want to have that conversation when you're ready.
Yeah. There's been other times too. Communication isn't always just talking about problems in your life or whatever. There's been times where I want to talk about a particular thing, ministry thing we're working on or something, and your mind is on a different part or work, and you'll be like, okay, let me do this, and then we'll talk about that. And so even respecting each other and being like, okay, I might be going through the list to do here, but he's not quite there yet, so I'll patiently wait until he's there. And every time he's like, okay, I'm ready. Let's sit down. Let's tackle this. And it's important to wait for each other.
Every time?
Well, maybe not every time.
Nice. Thank you.
I try to be patient.
Okay, why don't you take this last one then? This last point.
I want to share this verse in 1 Peter 3:1. It says, likewise, you wives, be subject to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by their conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. That was in verse 2. I want to take from this verse the word chaste. I think it's important, when you talk about your spouse, or especially your husband, or, well, I'm going to talk about my husband, it's always with chaste conversation. Keep private things private between you and your husband. It's not meant to be shared. Always make sure your husband looks good. Like, if I'm going to be at work talking about my husband and these people have never met him, well, they're going to have that opinion of you from what I say. So let's say I run into them at Walmart or whatever, and they see us together, and they'll be like, they can either be like, oh, that's the husband that's always talking down to his wife, or, oh, that's the best husband ever, because of how I have spoken about him. So it's important to keep your conversation about your spouse always in their benefit, just praising them, lifting them up. It's easy for us when we're in the flesh to talk about negative. It's so easy to be negative. So it's very important to make sure that you on purpose just talk about the positive in your life, whether it's your spouse or your kids or whatever you're involved in, because that's how other people are going to see those particular things, especially your spouse. So just remember not to ever talk to your family or friends about the fights you may have or things like that. Just if you really feel like you need to talk to someone, then you go to your pastor, you get pastoral counseling. But first, you should always try to talk to your spouse about the things that might be going on, or maybe the miscommunications you're having. So just keep your conversation chaste and respect each other. And I always wanted to make you look, well, you are the best husband, so I don't really have to work that hard. But but it's important just to not take any negativity that you have, take it out and just give it to other people. That's just something you would keep and work on with each other. And if you have to bring someone in, it should be someone that's actually going to help you work it out, not just a shoulder to cry in or whatever.
No, trust is so important in a relationship. If your spouse doesn't trust that you'll keep things private between you and not shared with others, then that gets into challenging issues whenever the bigger things come up. And can they trust you, or can you trust them? So those are just some thoughts as it relates to communication. So I'd ask you this. How is your communication with your husband, or how is the communication with your wife? Have you given them ample time? Have you given them your full attention? Have you set aside time? There's dates where we go on just so we can get our calendars together and we talk about things that are coming up. And there's dates where we just go and spend time with each other and don't talk about any of that stuff. There's times where we ask our kids, okay, it's time for you guys to go to bed, and we spend a couple hours up and do things. What I'm saying is you have to make the time to do it. Don't put the primary means of communication on technology, but interpersonal communication in marriage. Leave a level of intimacy in your marriage and how you communicate that's only between you and your wife. And then there's things that's just within your family, and there's things that are shared with family and friends, and there's things that is shared with anybody. Have layers of that and respect those boundaries in those areas for those topics that are have different levels of intimacy. So consider, when's the last time you spent quality time talking to each other as a couple? And I hope you spend that time. I hope you take that time. And we thank you for the time that you just allowed us to have here today. Thank you so much and have a great day.